Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement for WTTW, WFMT, and welcome to tonight's Chicago Tonight Black Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. WTTW's purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. The purpose of our WTTW News Community Conversations is to surface and spotlight people, ideas, and stories behind the headlines by creating a forum for residents, community-based organizations, community leaders, and residents to have authentic conversations. Chicago Tonight co-anchor and Black Voices host Brandis Friedman will moderate this evening's discussion, focusing on the impact of the 2020 presidential elections on the Black community. The lead sponsor for Chicago Tonight Black Voices is Fifth Third Bank. Additional support is provided by Gertrude and James H. Wooten Jr., the Joseph and Bessie Feinberg Foundation, the Abe and Ida Cooper Foundation, Nicholas Anton, Judy and John McCarter, and Haranda and Paul Donahue. And as always, thanks for the support of our WTTW members. Now I would like to show you the trailer for Chicago Tonight Black Voices.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight Black Voices. What are some of the issues that Black women want to see tackled in this election cycle?
If we can get past the idea of turning this into a political topic and really get to serving our communities, that's something I can get behind.
You are the first Black NFL team president.
Maybe we can use this as a calling card to unite.
We have to work together in order to make the world work.
Hello, that is the new trailer for Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Hello and welcome to Chicago Tonight Black Voices, a WTTW News community conversation. And thank you for spending your Monday evening with us. I am Brandis Friedman. I am the co-host, co-anchor of Chicago Tonight, and I'm also the host of Chicago Tonight Black Voices. In September, WTTW News launched Chicago Tonight Latino Voices and Chicago Tonight Black Voices on Saturday and Sunday nights at 6 p.m. And I hope you've had the chance to watch these shows. We just had a great show last night. It is posted online on YouTube as well as our website if you'd like to catch it. But along with these shows, we launched our monthly Voices Community Conversation series, which is happening right now that you're a part of. And it's a way for us to connect with and to hear from you directly. Tonight, we are talking about the election, and we are just 8 days away from Election Day, though millions of ballots have already been cast across the country. And as we all know, this election comes as the country is grappling with the coronavirus and confronting racial injustice, both issues that are deeply affecting the Black community. So tonight we'll discuss the election, voter concerns, particularly for Black voters, and the decades-long, or maybe even we should probably say century-long history that brought us to where we are today. So right now, all of you, you're in a listen-only mode, but that doesn't mean that you can't talk. In fact, we want to hear from you. So please chime in the chat function with your questions, and I will be sure to share them with our guests. You should know that we're also recording this conversation, and it'll be posted on WTTW's digital channels later this week. And please keep watching Chicago Tonight and Chicago Tonight Black Voices. You might see a little bit of this there. Sometimes we use it. So before we get to it, I want to introduce our esteemed guests who are taking time out of their busy election week schedules to talk to us. 3 work at news organizations around the city, and 1 has been working to encourage young people to vote. They are Rachel Hinton, she's the chief political reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times, Craig Dellamore, political editor for News Radio WBBM, Karen Hawkins, co-editor-in-chief of the Chicago Reader, and Stevie Vallis, executive director of Chicago Votes. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this community conversation. How is everyone?
Good to see you. Thank you.
Wonderful.
You as
Thanks
well.
for having me.
That's just my little trick to make sure that everybody's Zoom works and that we all know how to unmute ourselves. I'm kidding. So thanks for joining us. Let's go ahead and get right into it. So one of the more contentious races is probably the Cook County State's Attorney's race. Incumbent Kim Foxx is facing off against Pat O'Brien, who we had Pat O'Brien on Chicago Tonight just this evening, as well as Libertarian Brian Dennehy. Rachel, let's start with you, please. What are the key issues in this race?
I think one of the main things is law and order versus reform, or maybe a more progressive stance toward criminal justice. Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx has obviously personified the more progressive approach to criminal justice reform, much to the anger, contempt, chagrin of the FOP and other people who believe that maybe she's coming at this the wrong way. Pat O'Brien is a former Cook County judge who was a Democrat during that run of time, but has become or has decided to run as a Republican. And since that move, he's really talked about law and order in kind of the same way that other Republican candidates nationally have talked about law and order, making sure that people, if you commit a crime, that that there are consequences. Whereas Kim Foxx is saying, we should really prosecute people who do violent offenses, but maybe take a second look at shoplifters, or not take a second look, but maybe we don't need those people to be in jail. And so that we saw a big debate around that this summer, given the looting that we saw, especially here in Chicago and as well as nationally. And that put Kim Foxx and her progressive approach to criminal justice and prosecutions into a national conversation, looking at how we handle criminal justice issues. I would say that that's the main issue right now, or that's the main theme going on in this race, is law and order versus progressive criminal justice approaches. You're muted.
I failed the test. Karen, I was just going to come to you because I saw you nodding your head as Rachel was talking. What do you think are going to be the big key issues here?
I mean, those sound like pretty accurate. I feel like one of the reasons I was nodding is this notion of if you break the law, we're going to hold you accountable, but who's holding the police accountable? For me is the question. I live downtown. I watched the police escalate violence during the protest downtown. Who holds them accountable? That's why I was nodding, thinking, sure, law and order. For who? It's very convenient.
All right, so a number of other races in the city and the state. Craig, what are you going to be watching?
Well, I think the races that we're going to be watching, besides the Cook County State's Attorney's race, obviously we have to watch the race at the top of the Illinois ticket right now, and that is Senator Dick Durbin holding on to his seat, and likely will. But that race has it's the Republican candidate is a conservative former Lake County Sheriff Mark Curran, also Willie Wilson, the businessman who built his own way up from poverty into becoming a multimillionaire. He is running, African-American candidate there. So it'll be interesting to see how much of a draw he is in that campaign. But I think the other big races are congressional ones. One of them is, and probably the most highly fought one, is Sean Casten in the 6th District. He is the Democratic incumbent who upended a Republican incumbent 2 years ago. And he now is facing a challenge from Jeannie Ives, who is a very conservative Republican former state lawmaker. And if there's any race in Illinois that encapsulates what's going on nationally, this is that race. Sean Casten is very much in the progressive camp, and Jeannie Ives is very much a supporter of Donald Trump. And the arguments have been pretty much the kind that you would have expected at the national level. So that's one of them. The other race is in the 14th district, and that is Lauren Underwood is the incumbent, an African-American woman, not only the first African-American woman to hold that seat, but also the first woman to hold this seat that was once held by Dennis Hastert, who was at one time the Speaker of the House. She won that seat, upending a Republican incumbent 2 years ago, and there's a lot of money going behind the Republican candidate Jim Oberweis to unseat her. I suspect she's probably in a good position. They haven't spent as much money as they have on Jeannie Ives, but then again, Jim Oberweis has a lot of money and a lot of name recognition because he's that Oberweis, the ice cream and milk magnate. So it's been a pretty spirited race. So those are the main contests that we're looking at.
And Craig, I feel like those two contests were closely watched 2 years ago.
They were, in fact, but that was when this was the test of whether or not Donald Trump was going to be able to carry and continue on, have coattails. And it turned out that that was the blue wave. That was the year when Democrats, in fact, retook control of the House. And that's a main reason why this is a serious race on both sides of the aisle. Does this hold?
So Karen, national level, of course, we've got the presidential race in the last stretch of those campaigns, just 8 days to go. What are you watching for?
I'm watching all of the races we've talked about, and, in particular, races involving women candidates. So I'm watching the Lauren Underwood race. I'm also really watching the judicial races, and I'm very heartened that there is so much more attention being paid, particularly to the retention races. I think, for the Black community, I think the police get a lot of attention for the ways in which they interact with the Black community, but they are just one piece of the judicial system. And I feel like people realizing that the important role that judges play in this system, it's really heartening to me to see that. And I encourage folks to look at the Injustice Watch guide to judges and to really be educated about all of the candidates and to make sure you get all the way to the end of the ballot and not just pick a couple races and then just get out of there. Make sure you get all the way to the bottom.
Yeah, it's a very long ballot, and the Injustice Watch, their judicial guide, it's very thorough and really helpful. I certainly used it. So far, more than 1.8 million ballots have been cast in Illinois alone. Stevie, what are you expecting in terms of voter turnout?
Well, I think voter turnout's going to be high. I think obviously it's a presidential election year. Voter turnout is always higher than it typically is during a presidential election year. I also think that the political climate of this year is making people feel a little bit more inclined to participate. As we've talked about, the common theme here is, racial justice heading into this election. And with us here in Chicago specifically, having a state's attorney on the ballot and over 60 judges, it's easy to draw a correlation between racial justice and actually participating in this election. And that's not always as clear cut as it is in this instance. Jails and prisons, we just actually had an election in the jail the past 2 weekends. And when you're in the jail talking to those guys who are voting, who are mainly Black, the races that they are the most interested in talking about are the state's attorney's race and those judges that are going to be on the ballot, which I think it says a lot around the civic education and the opportunity to have a more civically educated populace after this election, given these two races who are down ballot but are so important to our communities.
Stevie, what are some of the, what are the big concerns that you're hearing from the younger voters? Is COVID a top concern? I would imagine for some of them, the systemic, racism and the injustice that we've seen so much protesting about might also be a top concern.
There's so many concerns that it's hard to pull one out. People are very nervous. I think there's just a general level of anxiety around this election. People are nervous that if Trump loses, that he's not going to leave the White House, and how are we going to respond to that? What's our role in that as young people in Chicago? Then you have people who don't want to vote, who feel like, both major political parties are corrupt and participating in this system doesn't matter. You have folks who are not very excited. They do see the difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, but they don't feel inspired to vote for Joe Biden. They feel like they're going to vote for Joe Biden as a vote against Donald Trump. So there's a level of apathy there, but hopefully the responsibility rises to the forefront. And then again, just racial equality continues to be the theme. And given that the two presidential candidates are in their 70s and they're white men, there's not a whole lot of interest in that being, or people aren't feeling like that's a priority on the presidential level. But again, like I mentioned earlier, and you'll probably hear me throughout the rest of this panel, pivoting to the fact that when you talk about racial justice, specifically in Chicago, you got a state's attorney who gets to decide who to prosecute, whether we're going to prosecute low-level drug offenders, if we're going to prosecute police who use excessive force. Then you have over 60 judges who are the determiners as it pertains to people going to incarceration, whether it be jail or prison.
So I want to take a beat and remind those of you who are listening, who are joining us tonight. First, thank you again for joining us. But also I've got a ton of questions, but I want to hear your questions. These guys want to hear your questions. So please, you're welcome to chime in the chat function and let us know what your questions are, and I'll be sure to ask them here. So amid calls to defund the police, President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence have taken a staunch law and order position, while former Vice President Biden, Senator Harris have called for reform. Here's a clip from Senator Harris at the vice presidential debate.
Look, and I'm a former career prosecutor. I know what I'm talking about. Bad cops are bad for good cops. We need reform of our policing in America and our criminal justice system, which is why Joe and I will immediately ban chokeholds and carotid holds. George Floyd would be alive today if we did that. We will require a national registry for police officers who break the law.
So, sometimes campaign issues are sort of generalized voting blocks, immigration being a key issue for Latinos, for example, when we know that Latinos obviously care about lots of other things, the economy, plenty of other major issues. Karen, is a candidate's stance on the police a key issue for voters, Black voters especially?
Absolutely. And I think it also breaks down by generations, though. I think this notion of the Black voting block is really convenient, but obviously there are so many differences along generational lines, along gender lines, along LGBT community lines. And so I do think for younger folks, that issue of the police the issue of police funding, I feel like is much stronger. And I feel like you see a lot of older Black voters really not being on board with any notion of defunding anything having to do with the police. And I feel like they are much more susceptible to this message of you have to vote against that kind of notion. And I feel like I've seen folks be angry that idea is being assigned to them. Like, I don't agree with that. Not all Black people want that. So I definitely think it's an issue.
And if I can add something in there, because I agree with Karen that this is a generational issue, but I think what we also have to deal with is where the older people in our communities are hearing a message that resonates with them, because when you have the kind of violence that we see in the neighborhoods every weekend, a lot of people are fearful, not necessarily of the people, but of the danger, and want to see some kind of change. So that's when they start hearing the messages of law and order and thinking, yeah, I want somebody to do something about these kids out there with guns. So we have to remember that those are legitimate concerns, but they have to be addressed as well. Just as even the defunding of police, it sounds horrifying to some older people, but very often people mean different things when they say it. And that is another problem. It's a broad term that can mean different things. If it means that we spend a little less money on police, but put more money into anti-violence programs and more money into mental health and other kinds of issues, the root causes of some of the violence, you'll find that many older people will agree with that. It's just when it gets to be this loggerheads where it has to be take all the money away from the police and get them out of our neighborhoods versus bring twice as many police in to sweep everybody off the corners, that's when you don't get the solutions and you just get animosity.
All right. Some people say, go ahead, Rachel.
Sorry, I think it also comes down to people hear defund the police, and that for a lot of people is just a non-starter. They don't really think beyond that. They don't think about, well, do you mean completely defund? Or some people think defund the police means abolish the police. So like those are two different movements and two different like schools of thought. And so I think there's not really an in-depth conversation around what defund the police looks like and what that could look like at the state level, at the city level, at any sort of like local municipal level. And I think really that would have to start there because you need city council members, you need more people to be on board to really determine what that looks like and how that would look like going forward as you plan budgets.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, the first year, this summer, it's probably the first time the concept of defund the police has really entered the conversation the way we've all been having it this year, because it's not an entirely new notion that people have been talking about. So moving on to Republicans, because they can be tough to find in the Black community, which has voted overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates since the mid-'60s. Earlier this month on Chicago Tonight Black Voices, we spoke with two Black Republicans in Chicago. Here's how one of them, Anthony Anderson, he's president of the Republican Precinct Project. Here's what he said about Trump and how he and the Republican Party have helped the Black community.
Well, one way I think that the Republican organization or the Trump administration is helping the Black community is by doing the opportunity zones, the historical Black funding for the colleges, the First Step Act, and helping Black unemployment rates stay down, and also just recently announced the $500 billion investment into the Black community. And so I think that will go a long way into empowering Black communities, of which, a lot of can be contributed, the downfall can be contributed to, delinquent Democrat policies.
So we hear reports of both campaigns fighting for Black male voters. And as of late, there have been some very prominent Black male voters who have come out in support of President Trump. But Craig, why the push and pull over the Black male vote?
I think, frankly, some of it is just watching the polls. When the polls have come out, it's shown that more men favor Donald Trump than women. So basically, they're trying to grab what they can get and what they already have, but also that kind of swagger, the kind of say what you mean, say what you're thinking, resonates with some people. I've actually heard that argument a lot, but this has also been, don't forget, there was a time when you could kind of figure that people, the message was that if we could help those who had less, then that would resonate with Black people. There are more Black people who have more now, who are business people. Those messages from the Republicans sometimes can hit with them. A lot of the Black Republicans that I've interviewed have been business people. And they say, well, yes, look, I'm this, lowering taxes on people who make more money is good for us. So I think we have to remember, as was said earlier, this is not a monolith. We are, African Americans are not one voting bloc that all votes the same way all the time. And I think that's why that message is going. And frankly, Democrats have taken African American voters for granted for quite a long time. That came back to haunt them 4 years ago. I think they're trying not to make the same mistake this time, but there's still going to be some stumbles.
Rachel, have both parties made concerted efforts to reach out to Black voters, both, state, local, as well as national?
I would say that sometimes it feels like pandering. It feels like, especially given this summer and given the protests and the looting and the unrest and the calls for justice and change that we saw, I think politicians seized on that and said, hey, look, we're going to make a change. Whether or not they actually do that, whether or not they change their platforms and really consider how there may be either benefiting from systemic racism or contributing to maybe like oppression or whatever. I'm not sure that people are actually doing that work. I'm not sure that people are actually thinking about this beyond an election and beyond just trying to get votes and trying to like flip a seat or secure an office. So I think we'll have to like look ahead, or we'll have to wait to see the real fruits of this, which kind of sucks, to see whether or not anything comes of it, if any change happens, and what that change looks like, should it happen at all.
Karen, to what Craig mentioned, have Black voters been taken for granted by either party, Democrats in particular?
Absolutely. I mean, particularly Black women, you know, they just know that we're going to come in and clean everything up. Like, you men are going to vote the wrong way. And that's why it's up to us to, you know, to save everybody once again. So
you're welcome.
Yes, exactly. Right. I just saw a woman wearing a sweatshirt that was just like, just forget it. I'll get it. All Black women, attributed to all Black women. And it's like, yeah, they take us for granted, and they know that we're going to bring our households, our churches, our women's groups, our sororities to vote. And, you know, I will say I am heartened by the vice presidential pick, because I do think there were some very, very, very powerful Black women behind the scenes who were like, look, Joe, this is what you're going to do. And I feel like that is a direct result of Black women starting to advocate for themselves and to say, you can't take us for granted. This is what we want in exchange for our support.
I want to take another minute to remind our viewers to submit questions in the chat if you have them. I would love to know what you would like to ask them. And I know you guys have questions. They're usually better than mine, so let me know. So moving on, though the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, which secured the right to vote for Black Americans, of course, it was nearly a century before all Black people could vote without intimidation. Here's a clip from activist and author Michelle Duster. She's also the great-granddaughter of Chicago's own Ida B. Wells, from earlier this month on Chicago Tonight Black Voices, talking about the right to vote.
Shortly after 1920, when the 19th Amendment was signed, or signed into law, immediately certain states decided to impose their own sort of states' rights policies, and those policies or rules basically disenfranchised predominantly Black communities. So, you know, with like grandfather clauses, poll taxes, literacy test, just a variety of different sort of tricks, basically, that didn't make it seem like it was about being Black, but it was about, but inherently it would impact mostly Black people.
Stevie, you know, do we still see some measure of voter intimidation today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gotten more sophisticated over the years. I think that having polling locations at police stations, having armed police officers at polling locations, keeping the right to vote away from people when they're incarcerated, and in some states, keeping the right to vote away from people when they have felonies on their record. As I mentioned earlier, the Cook County Jail is now a polling location. It's the only jail in the country that's a polling location. And there's only 2 states in the country where people who are currently in prison are able to vote. So these are laws that are in place that have most negatively impacted Black people. Because of these kind of policies, Black people are still the most disenfranchised population of any democracy in the world. So even though we've made these gains over the years, which have led to tremendous things happening for our communities, there are still a lot of terrible things happening to the Black community. And by continuing to keep Black voices away from the voting booths, those issues are not being elevated to the place where they need to be prioritized for our community. So yeah, you know, voter intimidation, voter suppression exists implicitly and explicitly, whether it's legal or just part of the culture or in the nature of the way we do politics.
And can I add something to that? Because I don't think there's no way to understate what Stevie has been saying about people being more excited and more involved in voting, because, I mean, in my lifetime, people have died for the right to vote. I mean, I have memories of cases of people dying for the right to vote. And yet, as Stevie said, there are still people, even within the community, saying, our vote doesn't matter, don't even participate in that farce. Let's just go protest. And I worry sometimes that some of that subtle intimidation is not necessarily intimidation, but the voices, sometimes from outside, sometimes from within the community, saying it's not worth it. Don't bother, because I'm sure Rachel has, and I know I have, covered political races that were decided by the flip of a coin. And that's because they were tied, which means that if you were in that area and you didn't vote and you could have, you would have been the deciding vote. So I don't think people realize that enough. And it's not just the issues of judges or the state's attorney's race. There are state representatives maybe in your area who are up for re-election. There are Congress members. Your vote can make a difference in those races. And I just wish people had the same sense of urgency about voting. And I don't care which way they're voting. If they had that same sense of urgency that they did when I was growing up, when people risked their lives.
One thing, I've been noticing, we've been seeing a lot of coverage, of course, of, the long lines that people have been standing in to vote early in places where early voting is even allowed, because it's not in some places. And I saw a tweet from someone the other day that said, to stand in line for 2.5 hours to vote, it is a poll tax. Stevie, what's your reaction to something like that? Like, I mean, it's good that we see so many people waiting. Part of the reason the line is so long is because of those extra 6 feet. But are we seeing, some modern, barriers to voting that, we think they aren't really existing?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. This happens every election season, no matter where you live. The lines are always long and people always have to wait ridiculous amounts of hours in order to cast their ballot, which is extremely difficult for people who are working hourly wage jobs, or who have children that they have to take care of, or who, like, they're trying to fit voting in, like, in a little gap that they have in a busy day, which is predominantly Black communities. And it's happening here in Chicago, and it happens all over the country, and it happens every single year. And there's ways to make voting more efficient. We need more polling locations, in addition to some of these social services that need additional funding here in Chicago. So do the election authorities. So they can have an increased capacity to have more polling locations, to be able to run a more efficient vote by mail system. We just have to prioritize this as a part of community engagement and as a social service, in a way, on the very highest of levels. And it starts really with how the funding decisions are made by city and state government.
Again, we do have one question in the chat, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, I promise. So thank you to the person who submitted that, but I want to remind all of you that you can still send us questions in the chat. I've got another one though. So if elected, Senator Kamala Harris would be the first Black woman and the first Asian American woman to hold the position of Vice President of the United States. Earlier this month, we spoke with Felicia Davis. She's the president and CEO of the Chicago Foundation for Women. Here's what she said.
Black women have historically gone to the polls in the highest numbers, and they bring with them their family members and their communities. If you look at the voter turnout in the last 2 elections, if that were replicated in 2020, that would mean 100 million more Black women would be going to the polls. And so in some respects, it feels like to elect or to have on the ticket a Black woman with her intersectional self as in the second highest office in the country is really monumental, and you can feel it. You can feel the excitement. You can see the mobilization that's taking place as women across the country are supporting her.
So Rachel, will having Harris on the ticket, is that going to mobilize voters?
I think people really are trying to figure out how they feel about Joe Biden. I think that progressives, as well as some others who maybe voted for Trump in 2016 or sat 2016 out, I think some might hold their nose for him and vote. But I think having such low enthusiasm for a high ticket or a major party candidate, I'm not sure that Kamala Harris is also going to bring out the vote in ways that maybe Democrats would like. I'm sure it will. I mean, obviously, we've seen 1.8 million ballots cast so far, but I don't think I don't think they're the reason why people are casting their votes right now. I think people are casting their votes right now because there's a pandemic and they either believe Trump hasn't handled it correctly or he has handled it correctly, and they need to vote to keep him in. So I think I think the significance of Kamala Harris's nomination isn't lost on people, especially Black women, as we've talked about multiple times. But I don't think that that's the real reason why people are coming out. I don't think that that's the reason why people are enthusiastic.
Karen, I'm going to ask you the same question. Do you think she's mobilizing for voters?
You know, I agree completely with Rachel. I don't know that she's necessarily mobilizing people. I do think she's shifting people's motivations in the sense that, like, I'm going to vote for Biden anyway, but I'm voting 80% for Kamala and 20% out of Trump. You know what I mean? I feel like if Kamala were not on the ticket, it would have been 100% I'm voting him out. And I feel like she maybe gives people a little bit more of a I'm voting for this ticket. But I think it remains to be seen whether or not she really is a motivating factor for folks in voting.
Craig, is she the future of the Democratic Party?
I think in some ways, by default, she is now. And that is because I think there's a general feeling that if Joe Biden is elected president, the idea of him necessarily going for another term is probably not a given. But I think Kamala Harris, having been a presidential candidate and a credible one, albeit not a successful one, but a credible, gives people a little bit more comfort. They see how she is on that stage. And I think people are thinking realistically, yes, she could end up being a president. And so she will be the natural choice. If Joe Biden doesn't run again, she is the natural successor. And assuming that they don't have some kind of horrendous thing happen during their term if they are elected, I think she'd be an odds-on favorite to win. So yes, I think she is very much the future of the party, which again can help motivate people and bring more people out one way or the other. Let's face it, Barack Obama brought people out on both sides. There were more people active who hated that he was president, as much as there were people who were very big supporters and overjoyed when he became president.
So I want to get to, we did get a question in the chat from one viewer. The question is, how do you feel about voting in prison, especially veterans who end up incarcerated? And Stevie, I'm going to bring this one to you just because in Justice Watch, the judicial guide that we were all talking about earlier, they did send these voter guides to Cook County Jail, but they weren't allowed in. Are there ways that, you know, voting is still being inhibited? If that makes sense.
Well, yes, I think absolutely. I think, you know, the first step is to get folks the right to vote, everybody. You know, people in prison are counted in the census. People in prison are taken into consideration when drawing political maps, but they aren't allowed to vote. That doesn't seem like a fair system. People in prison pay taxes. And I'm pretty sure no taxation without representation is like a creed of American democracy. And that's just a baby step. The next step is like trying to get folks who have had their rights taken away from them for, in some cases, 10, 20, 30 years, to actually understand who is on the ballot, what is on the ballot, and how voting impacts their lived experience as a person who is incarcerated. Which is why, when folks like Injustice Watch are trying to send these guides into the jail in order to help these voters who don't have access to regular television, internet, newspapers, gain some sense of civic education before they go to the ballot, and that being turned away, it's disappointing. It's disheartening, and it just kind of shows you that there's still a lot of work to be done.
So the media is sometimes criticized for its coverage of both female candidates and non-white candidates, both female candidates and those who are non-white. Karen, Harris, do you think she's been fairly covered this election cycle?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just saying that the media Harris has been criticized. Sorry, I'm looking at two different questions. The media is criticized for coverage of both female candidates as well as non-white candidates. Do you think Harris has been fairly covered this election cycle?
I mean, no, of course not. I mean, and I think it's part of the issue, of course, is that newsrooms aren't diverse enough and people are stumbling over themselves because they don't know how to talk about Black women in power. They don't know how to talk about Black women as viable candidates. So I don't think she has been covered fairly. I feel like this has just been such an odd election year in general, and she is also being overshadowed, of course, by the Trump factor. So I think that question points to both the problem with the political system and the problem with journalism not having enough of us in newsrooms making decisions about coverage.
To jump in on that, I think the Sun-Times, as well as others, we made it a point to be mindful of the photos we chose, because there were some outlets that chose photos where she looked sassy because she's a Black woman. And so you tried to make sure she wasn't doing any hand motions or like making any faces, because as soon as you have a photo like that, some people will just completely ignore whatever she has to say. She should be judged on her merits, just like any other candidate. And so that really is a point that we have to make in newsrooms, and that has to be made through photos, through captions, through sources you talk to in stories as well. And so I would agree with what Karen said. I don't think that she's been fairly covered, though I do think that there are a lot of people on Twitter and social media in general who say like we should be looking into her record as a prosecutor, as and things that she's done in California, her record as a senator as well. So there's plenty of fertile ground there. I'm just not sure that we're getting to it.
Stevie, on that note, she's been criticized for her prosecutorial record during her tenure as the DA in San Francisco and when she was AG in California. Is that affecting voters' decisions? The people that you come across and that you're encouraging to get out and vote, is this something they're paying attention to?
Yeah, people would be far more excited for her if that wasn't an issue, in my opinion, and the conversations that I've had. It's heartbreaking for me. It's very exciting to see a Black woman be vice president. I'm part of a generation that saw a Black man as president and potentially a Black woman as vice president. So the future is like really exciting for us from a perspective standpoint. But when you get to the fact that she was a prosecutor, and racial justice is so poignant right now, and at the heart of racial justice for very many people is our legal system. Over incarceration, mass incarceration, violent policing, so on and so forth. So it's hard for folks to get excited about someone who has made a career on locking people up. And there hasn't been a whole lot of time for, like Rachel said, for us to really investigate that record. I think a lot of people would feel a lot more optimistic if she would just get out in front of it and we were able to have like the honest dialogue, even if she could acknowledge that in some cases there is a mistake and simply say sorry. I think that would go a long way for our generation. I know that's not typically how you do politics, but you know, it might get her somewhere. But we just haven't seen that. It seems to be something that's being skirted around, which is not ideal.
And there's just 8 days left, so yeah. Okay. That's about it. It's not over yet though. I want to thank all of you for participating in today's Chicago Tonight Black Voices, a WTTW News community conversation, one of 2 additions to WTTW's influential and independent news and public affairs programming. We have shared a short Google form in the chat, and if you click it, you can submit ideas, stories, topics, and issues to us that you believe we ought to be covering. So please do take a minute to fill that out and share your thoughts. Before we part ways, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation, that you will also watch these half-hour programs, which are broadcast on Saturday. That's when Latino Voices airs. And Sunday is when Black Voices airs. That's at 6 p.m. on WTTW. They also stream live. They are on demand at WTTW.com/news. Facebook, YouTube, you can't miss us. And please join us Monday, November 30th at 8 p.m. That's when Ugo Balta will host Chicago Tonight Latino Voices, a WTTW News community conversation. You can go to WTTW.com/events to get more details on that. And again, my thanks to Rachel Hinton, Karen Hawkins, Stevie Vias, and Craig Delamore. Thanks to all of you. And I'm going to bring Tim Russell back in. There he is.
Thank you, Brandis, and thank you, everyone. As Brandis mentioned, we hope that you really enjoyed this conversation. And one of the last things that we do want to just say that if you have not voted and are looking for trusted resources for the general election on November 3rd, please visit WTTW.com/voter guide. It's a great resource for you to be able to go out and understand and find out what you're voting for and who you're voting for. Once again, thank you all for joining us. And until next time, be safe and vote. Thank you.